So this week then our first topic is our Bible. It would probably be helpful to have your workbooks open at this point. On page 65 there is this section on our Bible, and it deals with how the Bible came to us in its English printed form from the original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. So, we'll take a tour through history fairly quickly then. The Old Testament was written on scrolls in Hebrew. Scrolls that would look something like that. It could be rolled out with pages sewn together. They were written between 2000 up to 400 BC. Across that period of time, the whole of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and we can be sure that the manuscripts that the Bibles that we have now are based on the manuscripts that were written then, because of this discovery that was made in 1947 of what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were surprisingly a set of scrolls found at the Dead Sea, very imaginatively named. So they date from around 100 BC, so quite soon after the Old Testament was finished being written. So this is a relatively new copy after it was finished being written. And what was discovered was that these scrolls very much reflect very accurately the scrolls that our Bibles were translated from. So that discovery really confirms to us that the Bibles we have are accurate representations of what was originally written. So looking down your workbooks then, we're on page 65 in the workbooks, looking at the section on our Bibles, so how the Bible came to us from its original forms. So the Greek then, the Old Testament, the New Testament was written in Greek, but the Old Testament was also translated into Greek, what's called a Septuagint. It's the Greek version of the Old Testament. And then there was this Bible, the Codex Alexandrinus. There's also the Codex Sinaiticus, which were complete versions of the Bible in Greek. So the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament sort of combined into one Bible. So these are relatively original scripts that came about soon after the original manuscripts were written. But then when Greek was no longer the dominant language in the world, Latin became the preeminent language. This was translated into Latin from the Greek and the Hebrew to create this Latin Vulgate Bible in around 400 AD. And there was also at this time the Lindisfarne Gospels, which were the Gospels written in Latin, but with particularly pictures and that woven into them, I believe, very artistic sort of work. And that was then translated into English in the 10th century. This is one of the first times that any part of the Bible started to be translated into English. And this was followed by this man called John Wycliffe, who in the 1300s translated the Bible, particularly the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, into English. And this was the first Bible that was produced in English in its entirety. And that was from the Latin Vulgate. So it wasn't directly translated from the original scripts, but it was from the Latin translation. And then soon after that, in the 1450s, the printing press was invented, which revolutionised how Bibles could be produced, because previously they had to all be handwritten out and hand-translated and copied very painstakingly, letter by letter. But now they could be sort of mass-produced in the printing press. And so this man, William Tyndale, was heavily involved in translating the Bible into English, and he was the first to produce the New Testament printed in English, as opposed to handwritten. And he translated much of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, from the original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. And he was the first to do so. Previously it had been based on the Vulgate. But he never produced an entire Bible. Miles Coverdale in 1535 was the first to produce a complete printed version of the Bible in English, which was a huge breakthrough at the time, and we have much to thank Miles Coverdale for that work, and also all the others, of course, Wycliffe and Tyndale. And so Coverdale then produced in 1535 the first complete printed Bible. And so there's a chart here now which sort of summarises some of that. Don't try and follow all the arrows, I tried that, it just makes your head hurt. But that sort of summarises who used what to get to their version of the Bible. And what we see is they all lead down to this final point, really, in 1611, when the King of England at the time, King James, commissioned a group of people to produce a sort of common translation of the Bible, known as the King James Version, or the Authorised Version. And that's still probably the most common and most well-known version of the Bible that is around, and considered to be probably the most accurate translation of the original Hebrew and Greek texts. And that's probably the Bible we've all got with us today, a King James Version, or an Authorised Version Bible. So that's a brief summary then of how the English Bible in its entirety came about. So it's from the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts written from 2000 through BC through to about 100 AD, which were then translated into Latin, which Wycliffe and Tyndale then translated from the Latin and from the Hebrew and Greek into English. And then 1611, the King James Version was written. But beyond that, other translations, of course, have been made. And the King James Version has been revised, there is a new King James Version, and there are there's a large number of translations of the Bible which are available today. There's a list of a few of them there, there's many others. Some of these are accurate, some are less so. They've been translated in different ways. Some have been translated from the original texts and from the Codex Alexandrinus and so on. Some are almost paraphrases of other English translations, which are then of course less reliable. There's more human influence in what's written there. So what we would suggest is that when trying to choose a version of the Bible, talk to someone who's got some more experience, talk to one of us presenters for this series, or anyone else who's got experience with translations of the Bible. Some are good for reference, but not for reading in their entirety. So translations like the English Standard Version maybe I find very useful myself, or if I don't fully understand a passage, it'll be translated slightly differently maybe in one of the other translations, and you can get a better understanding, but may not be so good for reading in its entirety. So that's a brief overview then of the history of the English Bible, some of the modern translations that are available there, the Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, and so on. There are many of them available. And so, yes, we would suggest asking someone for advice when trying to choose a version of the Bible to read and to study for yourself.